Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with coach, speaker, educator, mentor, and author, the great Tom Kereszti. He has plenty of stories about leadership, sales, culture, teams, failure, and success. He recently launched his leadership book, C-Suite and Beyond. The book captures 30 years of stories in C-Suite across the globe. Essentially, he is an industry influencer who adds value to individuals and helps companies reach their highest potential through life-changing leadership principles. We get into all of this and so much more. Enjoy the interview.
So let's get into the interesting part here. And the first thing I want to ask you is this. You seem like a very busy guy, a guy that's driven by community. How did you survive COVID? How did you get through that time period, and how did it change you now that we're emerging out of it?
I kind of ignored all the stuff with COVID. It was, people kind of didn't want to see you, and with the power of Zoom and other online tools, you could still continue to meet with individuals. In fact, to a certain extent, it was easier because you can get a much broader, much bigger audience really anywhere in the world. You were not kind of, limited to a physical presence. So maybe, pre-COVID, I would be in a room with a couple hundred people, and then post-COVID, I could be on a Zoom call or a podcast or YouTube or whatever with thousands of people all over the world. So it was actually where the old saying is, through adversity comes opportunity. And that was really basically my mindset, is to say, look, I'm not going to shut down. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to be scared. I'm going to continue living my life. And, oddly enough, I'm in my 60s, so I was kind of waiting in the queue to get my vaccination. And then I was talking to a friend of mine and says, well, before you get your vaccination, because it's impossible to get anyway, why don't you go for antibodies tests? So I went for an antibody test, and it turned out I had the antibodies. So I had COVID, even not knowing I had COVID. I was one of those systematic people. And then when the second strain came around, which was the Omicron, what everybody was complaining about, I got it again, and it was like a bad cold. That was it. So, everybody reacts differently to COVID. I was one of the individuals who was unique in the sense that I was asymptomatic, but I think there's probably 50, 60, 70 million people that were the same. They just got it. They never knew they had it.
Yeah, that's the mystery of it for sure. The other thing, too, about you is that there's a lot of things on paper that you do, but I'm going to boil it down to kind of something that's digestible here, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to take you in front of a group of third graders at a career day. One of the kids looks up and says, what do you do for a living, and how are you qualified to do it? How would you answer that?
Some people have jobs, some people have careers, and some people get to live their calling. And I think, the key to a happy, maybe, and I don't know how you define success, because everybody defines success a little bit differently, but I think the key to having a happy and a successful life is to live your calling, whatever that is. So don't kind of focus on just getting a job so you have a paycheck so you can pay your bills. Even a career is more about, kind of you and your journey. And I think when you get to live your calling, then you realize it's not about you. It's about something much bigger than you, which is your calling. And it's really adding value to society, adding value to other people, rather than having a self-centered life, which is maybe a career or just a job.
So when you were a kid, what did you want to do when you grew up?
Well, that's a damn good question. When I was a kid, I wanted to play soccer. But, I love sports, but then, in a pretty short period of time, I figured out that I'm just too short to be a professional sports guy. And then my father was an engineer, so I went to engineering school, and I was kind of ahead of my curve because for my generation, I think the average was 2.3 career changes in your lifetime. And I probably did about 5 or 6, in the baby boomer age. I mean, many people started working for a company. First company I worked for was Colgate-Palmolive, and they had a magic number of 85. So between your age and your years of service, if you hit 85, you retired at 100%. So many people, were able to retire. That was their first job, and in their mid-50s, they were retiring and moving on and maybe starting another career or doing something else with their life. So, and that was common back then. You worked for a company all your life and you retired and you got the golden watch. I probably switched careers about 5 times, which was about double the average for my generation. And in today's generation, Generation Z, my goodness, people stick it to a company for maybe a year and a half, and then moving on and trying something new and something new. One just came across Tim Elmore just published a book on different types of diversity and really looks at the different generation gaps, because in many companies today you have baby boomers and Generation Z and everything in between. So how do they get along? How do they learn from each other? How do they work together? It's a pretty interesting read, and a pretty interesting mastermind to run at a company, to say, okay, well, you got all these generations, they view the world very differently, and how do we get them to work with each other, appreciate each other, and get along?
So you're a jack of many trades. You're obviously a highly motivated person living the way you want to live your life. How did this begin for you? How did these motivational seeds begin for you early on in your life?
For me, early on in my life, I always found myself in leadership roles. For whatever reason, I don't know. It was, whether I was on, my, sports team in high school or in college, even before that, I was always, captain or MVP or something like that. And then, my first job was always leading projects, and the way I would phrase it is, in many times you walk into a situation and there's a leadership vacuum. You're in a room with a bunch of people and nobody takes the lead. And my tendency is to always step in and take the lead if there's no leadership there, or if there's weak leadership, I'll have the tendency to step in and take over leadership of a situation, of a team, of a project, or whatever that may be. And early on in my career, it was I had a very self-centered approach. It was about me, about my success. Yes, the project was successful because I took ownership of it and I made it successful, but it was really self-centered driven. And then later on in life, probably when I got into my, late 30s, mid 30s, early 40s, I figured that really it shouldn't be about me. It should be about others. It should be about something much bigger than me. So then I shifted focus, and what drove me was other people's success, a big picture success rather than my success. And I realized that if other people were successful, then by association, because I made them successful, I was also successful. And, if a larger cause was successful and it was one of the cause that I was spearheading, then by association, again, I was successful. And I used to say my easiest job was when I was a CEO, because when I was a CEO, it really just boiled down to making sure that everybody's living a culture, making sure that everybody understands what the vision is and what their particular association or what their particular contribution, I should say, to that vision is. How do they deliver that? How do they make the strategic plan work? And it was really just my job as a CEO to equip them, to make sure that they had assets, they had, training, they had the contacts, all that stuff. So I just lived my life serving them and supporting them to make sure they were successful. And as my team was successful and as my company was successful, therefore I was successful. So the focus went off me and went on to others, and I just found that's a much easier way to achieve things.
So as a leader, you obviously respect that leadership role. Who's been a role model or a hero for you consistently in your life?
I had a couple. Early on in my career, I had this gentleman, Dr. Frank Borelli. He was the first servant leader that I ever met. I didn't even know what servant leadership was until later on in life. I kind of pieced it together. So, yes, Frank was definitely a servant leader way back then. So I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot from the CEO of Beckman Bankiser. His name was Bart Beck. He's a really down-to-earth guy. You know, he reached CEO status of a very large company, and he was just down-to-earth. It was common sense. And then another gentleman who was my boss, he was Erez Wigerman. He was a very good judge of character and people, and I called him the people whisperer. So extremely intelligent guy, but great people skills as well. For the last maybe 10, 15 years, John Maxwell has been my mentor. He's a pretty I would say down to earth, really big picture guy. I mean, he paints a big picture with some very simple statements that are life changing, and he's a great guy that I've learned, and he's mentored me. So it's not one individual, but probably I can boil it down to a handful.
So if you can meet anybody alive on the planet right now and talk to them for a few minutes, who would it be? Who would you love to meet?
Well, let me answer that question a little bit differently. I'd love to sit down on a park bench with Jesus Christ, because he was the biggest servant leader of all time. He kind of taught humanity what servant leadership is all about. How to love one another and how to respect one another. Love to kind of get an earful from him. And, depending on, who you talk to, some people say he's with us and is alive, and some people say he's a fictional character, and you're drinking the Kool-Aid when you talk about him. So, we're all over the place about his, presence or what he is, but, I love to get an earful, because, the fact is, he started off as an individual, and he had, 12 disciples, way back, a couple of thousand years ago. And whether you are, whether you believe in Christ or you don't believe in Christ, the fact is, almost half the earth, almost half the population on this earth, is a Christian in some form or another today. So that's a pretty good movement. Whether you say he was a son of God or he wasn't a son of God, either way, that's pretty spectacular that, he's got, half the population of the world following him. And he just started off as an individual and, with 12 followers. Something that we can learn from.
Yeah, for sure. So this question isn't about regret. It's more about what you've learned over your life. And let's say you have a dream tonight. You run into the younger version of yourself, and you can give that 20-year-old version a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained throughout your life. What would you tell your younger version?
I wish I would have figured out when I was 20 that it's not about me. Like I said to you early on in my career, I was very self-centered. I thought it was all about me. I always had good people skills, and I always had, good drive. But I use that, and manipulation is not the good word, but I use that to my advantage. I use my people skills to get people on board with my ideas, with my things that I wanted to achieve. And it wasn't, like I said, later on in life that I realized that it's not about me, it's about something much bigger than me. And if somebody said early on in my life, hey, Tom, it's not about you, it's something much bigger than you, that would have been, some good advice. I wish somebody would have come to me at when I was the age 20 and say, Tom, what is the vision for your life? What are you going to be doing 40, 50, 60 years from now? What is your vision? What's going to be your legacy? I wish somebody would have asked me that question when I was 20, so I would have started thinking about that and working on that much earlier. So big questions, but simple questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is your legacy? Since you mentioned that, when you lean back in your easy chair and think about your life, what do you think your legacy is, or what are you the proudest of?
I kind of like to answer this with, and I think I just mentioned to this. Some people have jobs, some people have careers, and some people have callings. And how do you find what your calling is? Another question maybe somebody should ask me when I was 20 years old and said, just simply, Tom, who are you? And as I mentioned to you, I'm a servant leader, but I didn't figure out I was a servant leader until much later in my life. And then the second question is, Tom, what are you passionate about? And I'm passionate about making other people better and making companies better, making products better. So I'm passionate about, fixing things and making things better. And then what are you good at, Tom? I'm pretty good at mentoring, and I'm pretty good at leading. Like I mentioned, every time there's a leadership vacuum, I kind of dive in. So with the answer to those three questions and clarity in those three questions, I can define what my calling is, and then I can live my calling. And it doesn't matter if, let's say for example, I'm mentoring people. Well, I can mentor my employees and I can mentor my kids, right? I can be a servant leader of my company. I can be a servant leader on on an athletic team. I could be a servant leader at work. I can be a servant leader of my customers. I can make my customers better. I can make my company better. I can make my family better. I can make my friends' lives better. So I can use that formula really anywhere I am in life. So that's why I call it a calling rather than a career or a job. And now that's what I want my legacy to be, that people say, hey, I became a better person because I knew Tom. I became a better husband. I became a better father. I became a better executive because the time that I spent with Tom and the things I learned from Tom.
So partly because what I do already is music, but more than that, I think over this pandemic, people really relied on art. What's been like an album or a book or something in the realm of art that's always motivated you that you've returned to in your life?
Well, there was a lot of books that motivated me. In fact, I got so much motivation, I wrote my own book to motivate others. But back around 9/11, actually before that, Jack Welch, Straight from the Gut was a great book. That's kind of when I read that. One of the things that I took away from that book was up until that point, I led separate lives in the sense that I was very professional at work, and I kept my relationships at work professional. And, I had my social circle. And then after I read Jack's book, how he, spent a lot of time with his direct reports, their families, and he kind of tried to form that, family unity in his inner circle. The light went on, and I said, well, actually, that makes sense because you're spending so much time with your direct reports, with your, inner circle, that they should be like family, and the wives should get to know each other, and the kids should get to know each other, and it just made a lot of sense to me. So that's one of the switches I made after reading, Jack Welch's book, to say, okay, it's not just professional relationships, but it's just relationships, and if you have good relationships with the people that you work with and you work for, or they work for you, it just makes things much easier. And look, it makes sense because when you have an after-work cocktail party, people kind of loosen up and they get to be a lot more friendly than doing a conference in a conference room at work. So that works. Rudy Giuliani during 9/11. I think his book was actually called Leadership. I read that book. Great book. Rudy, and it's something that I used in my career later on after I read that book. And he was the mayor of the city under crisis, and what he did was, he even before the crisis, he would meet with his direct reports once a week. Once a week, everybody had to be in the room, and they had to talk about critical issues. And I used that formula as I became a senior executive, and every Monday morning we had a leadership team meeting. Everybody had to be in the room. It was, unless you were on vacation, obviously, or, death in a family. But other than that, you had to be in that room, and we kind of reviewed the week before and reviewed the week ahead and see what crisis may have come up, what fires we had to fight, etc. So that was a mandatory meeting. And then I also then met with each one of my, direct reports for 4 hours once a month. It was a one-on-one, and that was an opportunity for them to discuss with me how they need my help, how they need my advice, make sure that whatever that individual was working on or whatever that department that individual was leading, make sure that, things were still on stream, and if they were off stream, what we can do about it and how I can help. So that's kind of stuff that I learned from Rudy Giuliani's book. Learned a lot of things from John Maxwell's book. I mean, I read probably about 10 of his books. He's got, I think, 30, but I probably read about 10. They're all great principles, whether it's the 15 laws of growth or 21 laws of leadership or Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. I mean, he's got a lot of great books. Simon Sinek had a new book, What's Your Why? That's a really good book. So there's a lot of good books out there, including mine, which is called C-Suite and Beyond. If I could get myself a plug.
Absolutely. In fact, that's what I want to do. I want to make sure that we properly get all of the good business out there. Talk to me a little bit about where the best place is to get your book, find out about you, your services, anything related to your world.
Well, C-Suite and Beyond, the 4 Keys of Leadership Success, you'll find that on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, probably a lot more online stores, but everybody buys books on Amazon, so that's the easiest thing. And, once you go to Amazon, I'm blessed with a last name that's very unique, Kereszti with a last name that's very unique, Kereszti. When you Google that name, you'll find my sister, who's a doctor in Boston area, or my 2 daughters. One is in Salt Lake and one is in Chicago, or me. So it's easy to track me down, and you can just go to my LinkedIn profile or go to my website, whatever is easier, and just drop me a note and say, hey, Tom, I'd love to talk to you about this idea. I'll invest 10 minutes of my time, or I got one of those calendars that you can kind of just book a spot on, and we'll talk 10 minutes and see if I can help you or not.
Beautiful, Tom. Hey, man, this has been great. Thank you for opening up. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, business, and music around the globe. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.